Okay, so we've had the Tomb Raider 1 to 3 remasters, and it looks as though 4 to 6 is incoming. And, well, John, you're a big
Yeah,
Tomb Raider fan. You must be really
indeed.
excited about this.
So I was happy with what they did with Tomb Raider 1 to 3. I made a nice video on it earlier this year. They essentially employed community members that had a long history with working on sort of refreshing the Tomb Raider games to bring these back. And you got both classic graphics mode as well as the sort of enhanced remastered, which was, higher quality textures and updated models and such. So it did have a slightly strange look to it because it was extremely faithful to the original core mechanics, animations, and all that, but they just updated certain assets. But I thought it felt good overall, and it looked really nice. 4 through 6, though, is an interesting one. First of all, I think 4 and 5 kind of got a bad reputation back in the day because this was during the time when Tomb Raider was an annual series. And by the time you get to Tomb Raider 4, everything's like, oh, another one of these? It was the exact same engine technology, nothing new. But I think in actuality, I would say Tomb Raider 4 is pretty good. I think it's a lot better than 3 was. And I think it's kind of uh it tried to go back to some of the more tomb raiding roots as opposed to like going heavy on the human based combat and all these weird sort of like around the world kind of locations that were more man-made structures, well, modern man-made structures, if you will. And there's some cool stuff there, and I think maybe with that distance people might be able to appreciate it more, so I'm eager to see that. But 6, they call it 6, and that's the first time I think I've actually heard it officially referred to as 6. They're talking
Yes.
about Angel of Darkness for PlayStation
Yep.
2 and eventually PC, which is a controversial game to say the least. This is the game that that basically put core design out of business. uh,
Yep.
they struggled to create this new engine, this new technology. They had some very ambitious ideas as to what Tomb Raider could be. And I admit, back in the day, I finished this game the summer it came out, and I liked it somewhat. I liked it conceptually, and I thought it was interesting as a game. It just felt very unfinished, right? Like it was clearly, it's like, oh, I'm playing a beta version of something that's pretty cool. And even though it was kind of broken in many ways, I was still able to appreciate and enjoy what they tried to do because there is some good stuff in here. And that's why I'm very curious to see what they do with this game in this remaster. There have been attempts to sort of improve it after the fact in the community side, but I really wonder what this is going to look like and like how much better they can actually polish it up. Part of the problem I always had with it was that the first half of the game, not first half, it's like the first chunk takes place in Paris and you're just running around the Paris streets kind of solving mysteries and talking to people, which is conceptually okay, but it was all divided up into these tiny little areas with like long loading screens between them, which to me
Right.
reeked of like we couldn't figure out how to do proper data streaming yet on the PlayStation 2, even though plenty of other games had at that point. Clearly, core design, they couldn't quite get that going, and they had to divide it up into multiple chunks. And later in the game, it's less of a problem, but early on, it really kills the pacing. Um, and I'll see if they can handle that. There's also the stuff with what's his name, like Trevor. I don't even. There's that male character. Remember? Where late in the game you take control of him and I think you're like in an asylum and it starts to play more like a survival horror game, uh which is super weird. And I don't
Okay.
know, so but I have not revisited Angel of Darkness since that initial playthrough. I have dabbled in it on PC, but my main focal point is on the PS2 version, which I loaded up recently actually, and I actually think it looks quite visually good for the PS2 era. Like there's some really nice lighting and effects going on. It does run at 60 frames per second, though it gets it because it's field rendered. It has that problem where when it does slow down, the frame rate cuts in half and it just runs in slow motion. Which was a
Okay.
not unusual problem on some PS2 games. So it literally had slowdown, if you will, because it ran slow. But we'll see. The PC version, though, back in the day, I don't know if you guys remember, it was one of the first PC games to support programmable pixel shading.
Hmm.
It was very well known for that because it actually had like pixel shader water and other effects where they did certain effects on PS2 that were probably leveraging the weird hardware of the PS2, and to simulate that on PC they kind of took it a different way and they implemented shaders into it, so it ended up looking kind of different in the PS2 game, but it had its own cool look with like reflective puddles and water that were all done using pixel shading instead. And it was one of the earlier examples of this, of a game shipping with those features, which again, pretty cool. I assume that's what this new version will be based on, that PC version, sort of pulled up with improvements, I hope. So either way, I will be covering that for sure.
Okay. Do you have any affinity with these Tomb Raider games, Oliver?
No, I do not have a certain affinity with these titles very much. I've not played them myself. I think this is very much a John joint here. The last round of Tomb Raider, yeah, I think just in terms of the interest, the last Tomb Raider remasters seemed quite successful, so I'd expect pretty good results here as well. Like that upgraded visual cauldron, that upgraded visual mixture with the revised textures, the models, the baked lighting, the shadow maps, seemed like a solid combination, seemed to produce pretty good results in those titles. But I do think their approach also does have certain limitations that we're seeing here. Like when you're keeping the same environmental geometry, you're not doing like big new complex model rigs, you're not redoing the animation work. I think there's a limit realistically to what can probably be achieved with like, especially these, PS1 era titles, 4 and 5 there.
Yeah.
And I do think like as you start to push rendering technology further, almost weirdly, the expectation for some elements of that technology increase, and you can end up in an awkward space. But I think they've kind of balanced it such that the lighting looks significantly better, but they're not kind of pushing too far in the realm of model detail to the point where the animation work looks totally discordant with what is already in those titles. So yeah, I think this is pretty cool. I think the quality of some of those later Tomb Raider titles is a bit more questionable, like John said. But it seems like a worthwhile project, and I hope to see a good, nice lengthy John video at some point close to release.
So,
Indeed.
John, we've got to go back to Trevor.
Oh,
I
I
sent
was
you a
wrong.
link with the Angel of Darkness characters. I'm not seeing a
Yes.
Trevor. Which one are you referring to?
I'm referring to Curtis Trent.
Curtis Trent.
Curtis, essentially he finished his tenure with Korn, and decided to become an action hero in Tomb Raider.
Okay, I'm just loving some of these character names in the
He's
in
very
Tomb
much
Raider.
of that era. Yeah, there's Werner von Croy, of course, Joachim Carroll, Peter von Eckhart, Christina Boas, Margot Cartier.
Awesome.
There's so much here. The one last thing though that kind of occurred to me though about these Tomb Raider games is that because they're still they're of an era where the geometry is relatively boxy and environments are fairly sparse and clear, right? Yet they're still challenging to navigate and figure out your way through. And I kind of realized that this sort of game kind of couldn't exist with modern graphics because
Too hard.
right, because you walk into a room
Yeah.
in Tomb Raider and your eyes you're able to easily scan the room and kind of understand where the different entrances and exits are, where the interaction points might be, and then it's a sort of figuring out how the heck do you get there. But modern graphics are so complex and detailed that I don't think you could rely on that. Like, I think you walk into a room this complex, but with modern graphics, nobody'd be able to parse it. You just look at it and be like, I don't know what I can do here. I have no idea what I can interact with. And this is where stuff like the yellow paint comes from. The graphics are too good now. Like, they're too detailed.
Right.
And some developers have managed to work around this and guide the player, but I still think largely we don't see level design as intricate as this sort of era of game, just because of the way that the complexity of these things. And it's a really curious sort of phenomenon, but detailed graphics kind of made this stuff harder to make in terms of like spelling out to the player what you can and cannot do.
Just to round off, John, we got this supporter question from Stuart Hart. Hello, double exclamation point. So Tomb Raider 4, 5, and 6 are getting the remaster treatment. While I feel it was admirable to bring the first three games to modern platforms, warts and all, I felt porting the games over as a near one-to-one replica was a missed opportunity. Considering Angel of Darkness is considered an, in brackets, very low point for the series, would you feel it acceptable if the game was remastered without fixing any of its glaring gameplay bugs? If they even fix all the bugs, is it a worthy endeavour at all, considering it's, quite frankly, a poor game?
Oh, I disagree with him.
Okay.
I think it's an interesting enough game that's worthy of this regardless, but I would at least hope that they fix the bugs. Because the bugs need to be fixed, because those were problematic for sure. But I think there's still an interesting game here, and it's not as bad as people have suggested. Although my tolerance for this is probably higher than most. This was also the game they introduced full analog control, by the way. It was no longer tank controls on PS2 at least. So I'll be curious to see how that plays out. And lastly, I mean, it's got Curtis Trent in it. Come on.
AKA Trevor.
AKA Trevor. Yeah, I mean, I don't know how he didn't become a mainstay in the series. Curtis Trent.
Well, yeah,
Crystal really missed out when they took over the Tomb Raider franchise. You know,
exactly. Yeah, there could have been some Curtis Trent spin-offs.
Instead of Lara Croft Tomb Raider, it'd be Lara Croft plus Curtis Trent Tomb Raider. And
Tomb Raiders.
Tomb Raiders. That's the Japanese name of Tomb Raider 1, by the way. Tomb Raiders.
Okay.
Okay, I'll stop now. I'm sorry for being pedantic and weird during this, but I have a passion for this era of these games, so